Hello, everyone. We'll wait just one moment more and then I'll introduce Brandy to you. All right, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Today we have Academic Focus, Spotlight on AI, Information Literacy and its Evolution in the Age of Generative AI. And I'd like to introduce to you Professor Brandy Whitlock, who is an instruction librarian at Arundel Community College and has developed a variety of classes and workshops for undergraduates, including library instruction, one-shots in nearly every academic discipline, and credit courses in student success, composition, creative writing, critical thinking, and information literacy. She's published a number of articles and books, chapters, and has delivered presentations and workshops on teaching and assessing information literacy at local, regional, national, and even international venues. So I'd like everybody, let's welcome Brandy, and I'll monitor the chat. If there are some questions, I might interrupt her, but for the most part, I'll just let Brandy go and we will learn more about how to apply AI literacy. Welcome, Brandy.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to hopefully share my screen and we can get started. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So, good afternoon, everyone. Again, thanks for having me. Thanks for coming. I am an instruction librarian. I head the instruction department at Arundel Community College. I see some of my colleagues among our ranks today. So oops, that was not supposed to happen. Just a moment, sorry. Are you still seeing my screen or are you seeing my background?
No, we still can see your screen. It's looking fine.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. That's not what happened to me. So hold on just a moment while I fix that.
I wanted to see if anybody in my group's on.
Interesting. It's completely left my view. So I'm just going to stop sharing for just a second and restart that part, and hopefully that'll fix things. So sorry about that. Technology, isn't it wonderful? Okay, let's try one more time. And there we go. Okay, so now you should be seeing it. Okay.
We do.
All right, excellent. So we're here to talk about information literacy specifically, and its sort of intersections with generative AI. And so I think it might be helpful to get a few definitions out there. I know a lot of people haven't necessarily used AI or know a lot about it yet. And so I just want to make sure we have a few definitions out there so we have some common language that we can work with. So interesting. Let's see if we can, there we go. So what is generative artificial intelligence? Sometimes we call it Gen AI. It's sometimes called predictive AI. But basically, when given a prompt, generative AI is a program that uses algorithms to produce text that attempts to address the prompt, or images. There are different ways that you can use generative AI, but for the most part today, we'll be talking about text. And then that gets sometimes used interchangeably with what are called LLMs, or large language models. Those are a specific kind of generative AI that learn to predict the next word in a sentence based on vast, huge, giant data sets. So that's where the word large comes in there. And so it's pulling from an enormous amount of data, this program, to try to predict what should come next in a particular sentence. Okay. And then we also have chatbot. And so these terms often, again, are used kind of interchangeably, and they do kind of do a lot of the same thing. But where a large language model is a kind of generative AI, a chatbot is even more specific in that it's trying to simulate human conversation. So when you get online and you're sort of chatting with the helper at Amazon or some other sort of store or service, a lot of times that's generative AI that's responding to you, not an actual person. And so the output of generative AI applications, you might have heard of ones like ChatGPT, that's a big one, obviously. Microsoft has one called Copilot. Google has Gemini, there's Perplexity, there's a number of other generative AI applications. And they work also based on, their output is also based on knowing the kinds of prompts a user has used in the past. So that's why they often pressure us to give it a login, because it can get better at predicting what we want by looking at the things we've already asked it for. So the more that you use a generative AI tool, the more individualized your output can become. And some generative AI applications also let you upload information into, content into the data set. So you can ask it to do things like, create an outline for an article that you just input. You could ask it to summarize, you could ask it to analyze. There's a lot of information right now, a lot of concern about AI and its analyzation of data, primary data. You can ask it to create things. You can ask it to write a poem. You could ask it to write an essay. You can have it to edit as well. So students and other folks might use it to, correct grammar the way you might use grammar check. And it can do that with text and with images. And so when you're prompting a generative AI tool, you can ask it to do things too, like you could ask it to change the tone of a text that you've provided for it, or to account for a certain kind of audience. I want this to be an audience of accountants, right? This we're in an audience of other accountants. You could ask it to produce text or images even that mimic a particular style, and so or from a particular time period. So and even sometimes a particular author or artist. So it can get very, very particular in terms of what you can ask it to do. Now, how successful it is at that is a different story. But those are the kinds of things that you can ask it to do. And lots of times people are surprised at how close these tools can get to what we've asked them to do. There's one more definition we really need to get sort of out there for our conversation today, and that is information literacy. And so if you aren't as familiar, when we mean information literacy, a lot of times people associate that with research. So finding information, searching for information, citing information, and those are all part of information literacy. But it's a little bit bigger than that. And so the Association of College and Research Libraries, this is the definition that we've sort of adopted from the framework for information literacy in higher education. From that document, it comes directly from that. And so it's really about being able to navigate this information ecosystem, not only to find things, but to create things. And so, and to participate ethically in learning environments around the use of information. And so it's quite a big idea, this information literacy, and it becomes more complicated and really has to evolve because of the way that people are now using and the ways that we might use in the future generative AI. So that's sort of what we're talking about, that intersection between these AI tools and what that means for how we're going to think about information literacy as we go forward. So there are a number of concerns. I've titled this slide Generative AI info-lit concerns, so information literacy concerns. But I have to tell you, these are just concerns that lots of folks have. And one of the biggest concerns that we have about the use of generative AI is bias in the output that it provides. When we talk about generative AI, we talk about what it's trained on, those large language models. Like we talk about them and we use that sort of phrase, like what's it been trained on? And what it's been trained on means like what it's subsumed into its data set and what it's analyzing and using to try to create the output that you're asking of it. And so the data that's used to train the AI can influence and does obviously influences the output, right, of what it's doing. And if the data is already biased, if it's already not diverse, if it's already discriminatory, it can be obviously and often is skewed then in the existing output and sometimes even amplified. So those biases can actually be intensified through the use of generative AI. We also have a big problem with these things we call sometimes hallucinations. For research folks like me, sometimes we talk about hallucinated citations as ghost citations. But basically, generative AI is not reflective. It cannot verify things. It's generating text. It's predicting what it thinks we want to see. And so often when we're asking it to find a scholarly peer-reviewed journal on a specific topic, it'll come back with a citation. We could even say, put that citation in APA style, and it'll try. But that citation might be hallucinated, and often what that means is that they just don't exist. So the author might be an author in the field that you're looking for. The title of the article will look very good. It'll look like an article you want based on the prompt that you've given the AI. The title of the journal might exist, but the title of that article is not in that journal, and that journal might not exist either. And the author might not exist even. So it becomes very tricky. When we at the library get folks who come and say, hey, I want to find this citation, it can take us up to an hour to try to hunt down a citation that doesn't exist. And so this has been an issue in trying to understand how information literacy needs to evolve so that we can talk about why these things happen, when it's appropriate to use generative AI, when it might not be, but definitely around citation and growing a bibliography in any way. It's not really good at that yet. And it's not just for citations. It can be inaccurate about a number of things. I asked it to create a biography of me, a short one, and it made up some really cool stuff that it thought I did. So it's not just around citation, it's around nearly anything. And again, it's because it's not just pulling information and providing it to you. It's actually predicting the text it thinks you want to see. And so it's a very different orientation that I think we need to make sure we're expressing to our students and colleagues when we're talking about the use of these tools. And so it can also be, problems with the prompt or biases in the information system that it's using that's been trained on. So there's other reasons why it can hallucinate. But even problems with the algorithm itself and the way that it's working. But it's really important to think that, it's hard for me to call the output of an AI information, a generative AI, because it's not reflective in the way that we think when we're talking about information that it needs to be. There's also disinformation, fraud, all kinds of things that people are intending to be distributed through generative AI and other kinds of tools. So it can, spread propaganda and disinformation and conspiracy theories and anything that it's been trained on, right? If it's trained on the internet, it's going to find those kinds of things. And so it's a big concern, disinformation. There's also the concern about sensitive information. You might have heard that generative AI has been used in some medical contexts to help diagnose people who have very strange symptoms or symptomology that they haven't been able to identify. And because it has these huge data sets that it can look through pretty fast, it's been able sometimes to come up with an idea that maybe a human hadn't thought of yet. But that information has to exist in a medical context in a closed environment because it's covered under law, right? You can't just put somebody's medical information out there. And the same is true with, court cases, all kinds of other sensitive information that we don't want folks to be able to access readily. Once it's subsumed into the data set for an LLM or another kind of generative AI, it can't be pulled back out. And so that sensitive information, then it's pretty important to have safeguards so that it doesn't ever go in. We could see, a medical researcher, inadvertently disclosing sensitive information about a patient, or a lawyer, inadvertently disclosing information about a lawsuit. Those are the kinds of things that we tend to worry about. Also, who owns the data and where did it come from? This is very mysterious. Generative AI systems, they consume just so much data. And so how is it governed? If it's of questionable origin, if it's used without consent, if it's used, if it contains a lot of bias, as we've talked about, right? All of those things we can't understand because we don't really understand where the data comes from. So that additional level of inaccuracy can be amplified by social influencers, by the AI systems themselves, et cetera, because of this inability to see where the data is really coming from. We also have concern about those copyright and legal exposure things. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes with some specific things, court cases that are pending. But sort of who can copyright a thing that AI produces, and how would that even work? And so these kinds of issues around information literacy too have to do with attribution, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. So how current the data set makes a big difference in the information that you get in the output. I shouldn't say information, in the output that is produced. And so a lot of times when you ask an AI, hey, give me the most up-to-date information on COVID, on long COVID research studies, it'll tell you sometimes we don't have data that's current. We don't have data. Our data goes back to 2023. Sometimes it won't tell you though, and it'll just make it up. But just knowing that most of the time the data sets that the generative AI that they're pulling from, they're not up to date. It's really difficult to explain and interpret data that's produced by generative AI. It tends to focus on, or it tends to search for correlation and not causation. And so it can be really difficult to ask it for, or to understand its rationale when it's giving you its content. So if you ask it to explain something, why it did something, it often cannot tell you. Okay. And then, although it might not be obvious at first, there is, even now, a widening digital divide, and that's a big concern, an information literacy concern. If more people have access to this kind of technology, it can use it in ways that benefit them financially, in terms of their quality of life, in terms of their work-life balance, all of that stuff. But it's not available to other folks to use. We only see that digital divide widen. And then we also worry about our workers, our information workers, especially. So it can be really difficult when it's been difficult as a librarian sometimes when people say, "Why do you need librarians? You've got the internet," or what do you need librarians for now? You have AI, right, to do your work for you or to help you with that. And so what that means is it's sort of kind of a brain drain, right? We don't get the people who would normally go into these fields and excel at them and transform them. coming into them when it seems as if it's, you know, sort of a dying field. And we don't really feel that in libraries, to be honest. We have plenty of people who come to us and need help understanding how to access or how to find or how to cite, or, you know, how to use information, how to assess it. So those things we still need to be doing, obviously. But what happens if there comes a time when people start trusting the AI more than they would trust an information professional? And that becomes an issue in our ability to provide the kind of educational service that we expect. So there's a couple of other concerns that relate to information literacy that are sort of specific to, you know, higher ed or really any kind of educational context. And the first is academic integrity. So, you know, is it cheating, right, to use an AI to complete your coursework? For some folks, we know folks in our business department, we know folks in our computer science department who are requiring students to use generative AI for certain things. And asking them to reflect on the process, you know, they're wanting the students to get more familiar with these tools. They expect to see that students will go into a job market where where the ability to use these tools might be something they need to be able to prove, or might be able to, you know, at least be able to talk about. And so it's very different in different disciplines, how people are approaching generative AI. A lot of folks in the humanities are like, oh my gosh, no, because we don't want the AI to be doing the things that humans do. And so for the humanities, things like art, things like poetry, and visual arts, folks are pretty concerned about the ways that generative AI might be used in those disciplines. There's also the concern, and this is, I think, getting more traction. There's concern about cognitive atrophy. Sometimes it's called cognitive obesity, which is different in the opposite. Anyway, you might hear it called that. But the idea is that the things that the generative AI can do, things like outlining, summarizing, writing, editing, those sorts of things, these are activities that actually help us think more thoroughly and critically, and that help us identify gaps in our knowledge, our understanding. And so when we skip those steps, when we give those steps over to generative AI, we're missing steps, important steps in the thinking process. And so people are very concerned that, you know, if students are having AI write their papers for them, then the student is missing an opportunity to learn not just how to write, but also through the writing itself, right? And so this is, I think, getting more attention in educational context, and obviously a concern overall, I think, about generative AI use. And then, oops, there was one more thing. Assessment. So it can be hard to say, oh, this student turned in this paper. I can see very clearly from this paper that this student has learned what I'd hoped they'd learned, when we're not sure if the student actually wrote the paper. And so how can we accurately, meaningfully assess what students have learned in this context, especially around information? And so one of the ways that I think we're addressing some of that at AACC, we're starting to create seminar-style classes where students are expected to participate and lead discussion, and you know, around common reading or around common activity. And by doing that, by having our assessment be the seminar, we can see a bit more clearly what students have learned and maybe where their gaps are. And so it could really transform the way that we're thinking about assessment if we can't trust the idea of the paper anymore. So the Cornell Center for Teaching Innovation gives us some information that's really helpful about sort of how folks in higher ed are using generative AI currently. Well, this is from July of 2023, so already old, a year and a half old. But these were some of the things that they could identify that faculty were using generative AI to help them do. So faculty might use generative AI to help with course content, materials. They might help them with their own research tasks, their original research. So again, analyzing data, especially that qualitative data that is so difficult to code and go through. They might have it assist with that, and then they can help it to write the course procedures and syllabi, and it can suggest course policies and learning outcomes and those sorts of things. The way that students have been using AI generally is they're trying to be more efficient in their studies. So it helps them to create, a study guide, or it helps them to outline those sorts of things. It generates those study materials like flashcards, that kind of thing, or brainstorming. They help it to improve writing. They might upload, their own essay and ask for help with the grammar. Unlike the most common spell check and grammar sorts of tools that we get in our word processing, or currently get in our word processing programs, you can ask the generative AI why something is incorrect. So if it says, oh, you've got a comma splice here, it might be like, you can ask it, what's a comma splice? How is that a comma splice? And it can, in many cases, help a student understand that a little better. It's pretty good at grammar. So students might use it to help with improving their writing. And like I said, you can get that instant feedback because you can ask questions that it will try to answer. And so it helps them to practice in sort of a safe space where they feel like, okay, nobody's watching. I can, try to figure out what a comma splice is on my own here. And then how they both are using generative AI tools is just to generate any kind of text from these large language models, this vast information that it's pulling from. It is helpful in many ways to aid diverse learners. So if you have folks who find it difficult to, who are hard of hearing or are deaf, it can help generate transcripts and other kinds of translation even tools for folks who are speak different languages. So it can aid a lot of our learners and their diversity in learning. And then and it can also suggest different ways of thinking, and in that way, and that's one of the ways it can help sort of accelerate exploration of topics. So I think that's how we're currently seeing our faculty and students using these tools. And so what's coming up pretty soon on the horizon, I mentioned some legal disputes that are in play right now. The New York Times and a lot of other daily newspapers, they're suing OpenAI, who makes ChatGPT. And I think Microsoft as well. I don't know who else they might be suing. But they're suing over the use of AI and having copyrighted materials in its large language models. So that, and I think that their claim is something like, if someone goes to your AI and says, what did the New York Times have to say about the Gulf War, right? It can make maybe a summary for you, and it's pulling from the New York Times. But if you wanted to find that information yourself, you would have to maybe pay the New York Times to get access behind their firewall to some of that information. And so they're claiming a monetary, a copyright infringement based on that. And what's so interesting now is that not only are they asking for billions in damages, in terms of the money, but even maybe more importantly, they're asking that the data sets be destroyed. And so Chat GPT, as we know it now, would sort of have to go away. They'd have to rebuild the data set that it pulls from. And so that could be a real setback for Chat GPT and Copilot and any number of other AI companies that they're suing. There's some authors who are doing the same thing. John Grisham, I think, is among them. Ta-Nehisi Coates, one of my favorite authors. They're also in a suit, I think, to along the same lines. Like these are machines that are subsuming in their data sets our copyrighted work. We're not being compensated or even understanding how they're using our work, how it can be manipulated, or yeah. So they're very concerned about how their information is being used. So I think George R.R. Martin is in there too. Yeah, a bunch of folks. And then we're also a bit concerned about media content that's being generated by AI. So there's been a couple of newspapers who've been called to task. They've been accused of using AI to just create articles about sports, or most often not about at least that we've seen so far, about things like presidential activity or sort of big national and international concerns, but definitely around things that are more entertainment or sort of light fare. There's a lot of generative AI doing that work now, and so that's sort of a concern. Like, how do we understand that in our information ecosystem now? Is that, what is that? And so a few months ago, I don't know if you remember, but like this voice that Chat GPT, that you can choose to be the voice of your AI, was named Sky. But it was Scarlett Johansson's voice, y'all. They stole her voice, and she got real upset. And so she had actually declined. They had asked her if they could use her voice, and she declined. And so they just made it up. And so we might see more things like that, which sometimes we call deep fakes. So photographs, images, videos, writing that look a whole lot like the president, or a sports figure or an entertainment figure, saying something really terrible or saying something really controversial, and it's not really them. So these are some of the concerns that people have coming, and so how can we help folks? And you're going to see a theme here in what I've sort of put together. But on the left-hand side of this table, we have a research need, and on the right-hand side, we have things we could use instead of AI. And so, excuse me, if you're looking for overviews, background, context for things, related topics, we look to things like reference books for those things. They're short, they're to the point, and we can find things pretty readily in those places. But the first resource always is the librarian. We don't know everything, but we do know how to find most things. And so you'll notice that that's a bit of a theme among these different research needs. We also have library guides. A lot of us create these guides, and so we can point students to those. We can embed them in your courses. We can provide access to just certain kinds of databases like Credo Reference that are very specifically reference books and designed to give that kind of information. We can get help with generating useful keywords and figuring out search language. Also, librarians are really good at that. The faculty in a particular discipline are excellent at that too. There are some controlled vocabularies and taxonomies, like we have in medical research. We have MESH, which is a set of common language that folks try to use and tag as they're creating information and as they're making it accessible. And so for formatting citations, it's getting better at formatting citations, but it's still not that great. And so librarians, of course, are going to help you out a lot with that, and too, with identifying appropriate resources, we're going to be your best bet. But then we also have our guides, our databases, and then also, specific websites for style guides like MLA and APA. They have great websites that provide great information. And why would I use a generative AI to help me with that when I could go right to the website if I just knew that it was the right thing to do? So we have some, I think, concerns that we don't have consensus around yet. And so I'm hoping that we can maybe think about some ways to build consensus and to help us participate in conversations around campus that have to do with things like addressing the hallucinated output. I think it's so important that students understand why this is happening, when it happens, what to do about it. And it can be really difficult to design research assignments that are sort of discourage inappropriate use of generative AI tools, especially when the output that you're asking students to give you is a paper of some kind. It can be really difficult to design those well, but how we do that, is going to have a lot to do with scaffolding. I think it's going to have a lot to do with, hands-on in class time work that we're watching and helping students through. So we're not expecting that they do it on their own at home, where they might be able and be tempted to use these tools inappropriately. Providing attribution, this has been kind of a big deal. Like, we get questions from a lot of folks, how do I cite AI, or how do I get my students to cite their use of AI? But there's all this kind of anxiety around it. But it seems to involve a bit of confusion about when to cite AI output as like relevant information or evidence, in a paper, to support your argument, versus acknowledging the use of a generative AI application in the research and composition process. So that outlining and summarizing, analyzing, creating, editing, like, how do I get students to acknowledge that they've used AI for that, which is a little bit different than like citing it as a source. And so I think some of the angst around attribution has to do with sort of understanding that difference. And it also stems probably from these just sort of uncertainties and competing ideas about the purpose of citation. So are we citing something so someone else can go and find what I found? Because that can be difficult with something that you created with your own prompt that doesn't exist really outside of this application. And so how should we be talking to students and colleagues about the ethical and practical considerations around referencing generative AI output in their academic and professional context? Given that just the function of citation, the rationale for it continues to evolve, especially. And then how might, again, we build that consensus across our libraries, across our campuses about how to approach issues around this attribution. We have currently some samples from APA. MLA caved finally and gave a guideline for an example, citation for how to cite something from a generative, specifically Chat GPT, but from a generative AI application. But both of them and some of the other citation styles too, they've given some information about maybe how to reference using one of these tools in the writing process and research process. But there's there's questions around that. Like, by establishing these conventions for referencing this generative AI output, are these style guides implying that this is the kind of quality information that scholars and researchers would trust and choose to reference over other kinds of information? Like, how can this generative AI output be more credible, more reliable than, say, Wikipedia content, when generative AI's output has been trained on that content, right? It's produced from these large language learning models that have been scrolling right through all that content, and gathering it up from places like Wikipedia and all this other Web 2.0 content that we so often, right, discourage people from using in these academic and professional contexts in favor of sources that are, generally more authoritative, more reliable, more stable, definitely more transparent, right? We can see where the information is coming from. So yeah, there's just a lot of questions that we have about providing attribution and the ethics and understanding of why we're doing that. And then, of course, we also want to prioritize humans. We want to, I had a colleague recently say, I'm not anti-AI, I'm pro-human. And I thought that was just really profound. And so I'll keep saying it and try to give her credit. But the idea, what I think behind that is, it's not that I'm concerned that, some folks are using generative AI to do things, but more that I'm concerned that we're not thinking about the human consequences, and we're not prioritizing human creativity and human well-being. Especially if we couch some of our ideas about using generative AI as like efficiency. It's more efficient to do that. Yeah, but is it better for us to do that? Why do I need to be more efficient in this kind of work when that's the kind of work I really want to be doing? And really get into. So it can be a real concern about prioritizing our human work, and especially that creative and intellectual work. And so I think we need to really be thinking about that in terms of our information ecosystem as well, and how to make sure that humans are doing the work. If you ask an AI, for instance, to go and create a list of 20 citations for the best articles to read in a particular field on a particular subject, does that remove you from the process of looking through possible articles, seeing what's available, choosing for yourself from among those things what seems most relevant or what seems most intriguing? We miss a lot of the serendipity, right, that can happen in the research process if we ascribe some of those tasks to an AI. Okay, so I've talked a long time. I'm ready to hear your questions or concerns. I hope that you've been utilizing the chat. If you have ideas, I'd love to hear them about how we can address generative AI and in our information literacy landscape.
Yeah, so feel free to share in the chat or even to put on your mic and ask some questions or even share experiences that you had. One thing that the AI experience has reminded me of is when Google first came and we were all up in arms about it. So, so Brandy, I mean, what do you have like some idea of when the hype settles down, what might be AI's presence in higher education?
I've been talking with some folks about this, and it's couched so often as an inevitability, right? It's coming. How are we going to deal with it? For librarians, I know we've been talking about like our students are going to ask us questions about this. How are we going to talk to our students about this? And so there's this sort of idea that it's coming, get ready. And so, but I'm not sure how it's going to shake out. I know folks at my college, folks at other colleges who work, behind the scenes in different departments, they're using AI in their daily work. That makes me a bit nervous, personally, but it seems as if it's becoming an accepted tool, and maybe it'll be fine. People were very concerned about calculators in math classrooms. What do we do if people can't add by hand? But we've managed. So and even that cognitive, the sort of cognitive atrophy that we're worried about. Lots of technologies people have been concerned about that with, including things like the internet or even the book, right? The book was going to mess with our memories. We weren't going to be able to remember things anymore because it was all just going to be in the book. And then what happens if the book gets destroyed? Then we won't know anything. So right, there's all these questions around technology that I think happen all the time. But the question I think we need to worry about is how to mindfully address them. Like what's important here. And in terms of information literacy, like especially the research process, what is important about that process that we want people to be able to learn to do for themselves? And how can we prioritize that in our curriculum and our pedagogy?
Well, John has a good question. And I've sort of forgotten about all this because, I've gotten used to detecting it on my own. He asks, what is your position on using AI detector tools at this point?
They are always a step behind, right? Because that's how it always works. Plagiarism of any kind is usually, one step ahead of us as people who are looking for it. It becomes easier for me to tell by just having seen so many of them. The output. They often take on a very similar tone. They had, very similar. And if you have students and a lot of them are using it, they're asking the same question to the AI, so it gives them similar answers. And so sometimes you can detect an AI use because just so many students have the same kind of answer. And so you can see that they've used it there. But I was a writing instructor, and so for a long time, and so for me, I can often tell just by the changes in the writing, a style, and specific kinds of usages and stuff. But they're not very good yet, I don't think, at detecting, in the sense that you're not sure where you're not sure where the detection is pulling its information from. So there have been some folks. There was in Georgia, there was a professor accused a bunch of students of using generative AI and cheating with it, and by having used one of these tools, these other applications, and it was wrong. And the students, they failed, and he like railed against them, and he couldn't believe this many students were doing this terrible thing. And then it comes out, oh no, actually, it wasn't like that. So they're fallible as well. And so it's really difficult to sort of trust them. I mean, it's interesting to have students put them through as maybe like a learning tool, the same way we might have used what was that one plagiarism catcher? Turnitin, right? Students could upload information, their papers into Turnitin. It would say, oh, this looks plagiarized. This looks like you got it from somewhere else. This looks, like you need a citation, or, and so in that sense, it could be a learning tool, right? You can have a conversation with it. But in terms of like policing or catching students, I don't think it's likely going to be very good at that. Sorry.
Now, Rose shared an experience, and this might offer some good comments. I had a student loaded the grading rubric in AI, then loaded her paper and had AI grade it based on AI's interpretation of the rubric. She corrected the paper based on AI's interpretation of the rubric. Rose did not follow up with her to see if the instructor and AI agreed on the rubric. Still, seems a little bit smarter use of AI than we've seen. Oh, and she was not Rose's student. It was just an experience she learned about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are ways to use it as a learning tool. We just can't be sure that that's how a student would be using it. Like I said, you can ask it to explain things to you. Why is you said this is a comma splice? What is that? Why is this why does it fall into this category? And it'll try, and sometimes it does a pretty good job. Math problems the same way can often help students understand better why their math problem, their process has, not produced the correct answer. So it can be used in a lot of really interesting ways. It's just, and a lot of really helpful ways, a lot of ways that help students learn. But it also can be used in ways that students can use to avoid learning. And I think that's the biggest concern that we
All right, and if anyone has more questions, let us know. This might be the last question before we wrap up, unless one pops up. But when you were talking about information literacy, and we have those information literacy classes often in English 101, throughout Maryland. And the focus so far has been on getting good sources from the library, what you should or shouldn't do from the internet. But what do you think, what direction do you think we need to go as educators in terms of information literacy as it pertains to AI? Do you have any like visions of what you expect? Should it still come from library instruction? Should it come from other areas? What do you think is an avenue we should explore?
Yeah, I think information literacy, like communication, critical thinking, these are sort of core competencies or core sort of outcomes of a general education of college and university education. And so I think it has to be taught across the curriculum. I don't think it. I see students sometimes for 50 minutes the entire time they're with us at the college, right? That's not enough time to help them really understand what AI is doing, what generative AI problems might be, right? It's got to come from, and so that's one of the reasons I was talking about sort of building consensus across campus so that we're all sort of speaking with the same voice. We're all sort of, talking about the same concerns. We're all giving students the same, caveats and warnings, and also, helping them use it effectively. If it's a tool that does help you. I have a friend whose English is not her first language. She speaks and writes English better than most native speakers, but she's not confident about it. And so she'll often put something she's written through, a generative AI, and it might pull out something that, a grammar issue or a turn of phrase that, anyway, it just helps her feel more confident before she puts it out. Now she goes through it and reads it. She doesn't just, have it redo it for her and then is not reflective about that. She goes back through and changes things. But so there are uses if having trouble generating search language, or if you're having trouble brainstorming related ideas or topics. It can help with those things. It's not the wrong tool. I think there are better tools, but it's not a bad tool for some of those functions. But I think we all need to. I do think it needs to be across the curriculum. That we're talking about these issues, even when we're asking students to use the AI to help complete their work.
Well, thank you very much. This has been pretty helpful. And there are some things that I think were sort of new to me. I mean, I knew about hallucinations and the biases, but the point you made, even though I think I knew it, I never drew it out about that it's searching for association rather than causation.
Right.
That's really telling. And that's probably an important piece that I added to my repertoire, and I'm sure other people have too.
There's one more thing I would like to mention that I didn't include in this conversation yet, and because it's not quite an information literacy component, but the environmental concerns that we have over the use of generative AI are substantial. It uses an incredible amount of energy and other resources, even just to play around with it. I start to feel guilty even asking people like, "Oh, try it out," because it's so resource consuming, and that might change over time. It might get more efficient over time, and we know now people are working on that, but it is incredibly it is a big energy suck, and I think people need to know that in terms of sort of when they choose to use it, what they're choosing to do. So thank you for
That,
having me in this conversation.
yeah, thank you. And we're going to share our screen again. So if any of you need to take a photograph of this image so that you can have it for your professional development, please do this at this time. And I want to thank everybody for attending. I think it was valuable. It offered some insight and sort of wrapped it together in a nicer package. And, we look forward to having you at future webinars. And if you have suggestions of webinars, feel free to contact Maryland Online. We are always looking for new and interesting information for faculty, for staff, for instructional designers. And We are even interested in pulling some talent if there are other people that would like to do a webinar for us. Anyway, thank you very much for attending today, and thank you, Brandy, so much for your presentation.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.